Now I'm going to introduce Maria Fernanda Cardoso, who will now speak. Many of you may have already met Maria. She's been here this week. Maria was born in Colombia, and she's lived and worked in Sydney since 1995. She's a graduate from Yale University with a master's degree in sculpture and installation in 1990. She exhibits widely in major museums and galleries in the US, Latin America, Australia, and Europe. She had a major show, Zoomorphia, at Sydney's MCA, and a mid-career survey at BLLA, the leading contemporary art museum in Bogota, Colombia. In 2000, the Museum of Modern Art in New York commissioned her to make a major installation for their Millennium Show, Modern Starts. And that subsequently traveled to the San Diego Museum of Contemporary Art, the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, Miami Art Museum, and Walker Art Center. In 2003, she represented Colombia at the Venice Biennale. Among other recent projects include show at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York, PSI, San Francisco Exploratorium, the Centre Georges Pompidou, the Daras Foundation in Zurich, and the Centro Reina Sofia in Madrid. Her most renowned project, the Cardoso Flea Circus, was recently acquired by the Tate Gallery as part of its permanent collection. The circus has been widely exhibited in festivals and museums around the world and was performed at the Sydney Opera House as part of the Sydney Festival 2000, where it was a smash hit. Cardoso has been a visiting artist and professor at California Institute for the Arts in Los Angeles, the San Francisco Art Institute, and the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota. Please welcome Maria Fernanda.
Good morning. Yeah, thank you. Did any of you come last night for my artist talk? All right, good. Because last night I spoke mostly about my animal art, and I excluded some of those pieces here because they didn't have direct references to my sense of home. I thought I would, because this is a university, I thought I would show some student work, which was very important in, just developing a line of thought that had carried throughout the years. I left Colombia 20 years ago to do an MFA in sculpture. So I left for 2 years. It ended up being 10 years living in the US, in New York, New Haven, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And then I moved to Sydney, where I had resided for the last 10 years. So it's 20 years of being away of home. And doing these presentations, I realized most of my work has to do with that. And sometimes I directly addressed it, sometimes it has been more subliminal. But it seems that it has been really anchoring point for me. When I was at Yale, I started to work with soil, with dirt. I come from Bogota, and the savannah has beautiful, dark soil, humus, very rich, and it's a very green area. It used to be a swamp. So I was working with my sense of home through very direct means, dirt. I made a bed made out of pantyhose and soil. But at that time, this was 1988, we were dealing with a lot of terrorism and political violence, and I was dealing with so many deaths, and my question was, how can we sleep with so many deaths? Making a reference to the Princess and the Pea kind of story, and the mattress. I don't know if you ever heard it when you were children. And I started to make a lot of artifacts with soil. And growing potatoes. I come from potato land. For Christmas, we had potato soup. It's ancient food staple. So I made this box made out of dirt, and I put potatoes, and I watched them grow and fill the space. And I thought that was quite fascinating. I also made hand and feet made out of dirt, and the feet resemble potatoes. And I realized a lot of my heritage comes from tombs, from archaeological diggings, because in Colombia we have a very strong pre-Columbian culture, and we studied it at school. And so there was this odd combination of the human figure and body parts with things that are grown in the soil. So again, it was making references to dismemberment and found body parts. And most disturbingly, I was in Bogota last August having a show, and there is a lot of massive graves being digged up and bodies that had been dismembered. It seems like a common practice. So this work, I find really disturbing to look at the moment. And on the left, you can see some pieces of dry corn drawings, I call them. I was starting to also work with corn because I was indoctrinated as my heritage being, we come from the Indians cultivated the land, they grew up corn. And these were the basic foundations of who I was. And I also was trying to recreate the sense of the green of the grass where I'm from, and feeling the pantyhose and rotating it and looking at the roots. And the corn, so growing corn. So I just put these little squares of paper and watered them. And it was quite extraordinary to look at. And I was really fascinated by just an instant in which it is just perfect. It's just, it's so vigorous and healthy. And at some point it just starts to wilt and die. And I realized that body of work you cannot preserve in a moment. I used the corn cobs to make this coil. And this is Indian corn, so it has different colors. So it had red, pink, and white. And also did a whole year of research on corn. And in all Mesoamerican cultures and South American cultures, it was the foundation of culture. So I started to make the alphabet and make it sprout with corn kernels, because these to me these were just the building blocks of our culture. These are the vowels. And eventually, this is the ideal moment. And then when I showed them dry, I didn't like them as much. But that took me on to working with preserved animals and the idea of exhibiting death and trying to preserve an instant. So I did this piece, was titled Crown for a Chibcha Princess. And it's made out of preserved lizards. And they are put in the position of the pre-Columbian representation of animals, which is geometricized, stylized into 90-degree angles with the hand and feet. And that way removed the sense of being cadavers. But it didn't push them all the way to make them look as if they were live lizards. And Chibcha is a pre-Columbian culture from the region I grew up. And to me, this piece had to do with sacrifice, because it resembled, the previous piece, resembled a crown of thorns and the idea of transcendence. And I did this in the context of terrorism and violence and the idea of sacrifice, how people can sacrifice their lives for an ideal. Journalists were being killed. The police survived 2 bombs that tried to assassinate it. Union activists got killed. 4 candidates for the presidency were killed in the same year. So there was a lot of death in our daily life. Shopping mall blew up in Bogota. Jet was blown up by Pablo Escobar. So it was just too much, and this was my way of dealing with it. So I was carrying the pain of home with me, and this is how I was processing it. But also the choice of animals had to do with home. It was animals from my neighborhood where I grew up. There were lizards, there were frogs. I played with snakes. Nothing was poisonous, by the way. But the green couldn't be preserved when you work with with taxidermy. Green is produced by the animal, so you cannot preserve that. Frogs, I wanted to be a frog when I was a girl. So the idea of repetition and putting these animals in this position made them become, patterns, and it made reference to a lot of pre-Columbian design, but it also made sense, the idea of movement, so they look as if they are walking or dancing, and it reminded me of early cinema. It's just, still animation. It's the same image repeated to create the illusion of movement. So when you go to the Gold Museum in Bogota, you will find frogs, lizards, snakes, and this is our identity. Grasshoppers. Later, this is 1992, I had moved to San Francisco, and I had decided to work with exotic materials that hopefully people wouldn't recognize, or Americans wouldn't recognize, just changing the context of the materials. So I went shopping to Colombia, and I bought everything that I thought people wouldn't recognize. So I got gourds and calabazas in the front, which is half gourds. And actually, these are pre-Columbian artifacts. Gourds is the fruit dried, and it's a hard shell. But the pre-Columbians used them as, plates and containers. And some of them used to, a lot of them rotted, in tombs. They were buried with the people, but some of the lids, for example, were made out in gold. So we say, we found that, and, it's obvious that they had been in use for more than 500 years, if not millennia. And I was surprised that in Colombia we still use them. We still have them around, and we use them to pour water, candy. A lot of crafts are made with them, musical instruments. And I started to make these kind of modernist sculptures. It reminded me of Brancusi and Jan Arp, just organic shapes. And on the left is cola. It's glue. It's made out of the cowhide. And this is the old Carpenters Glue. This is before synthetic glues. And I was really intrigued because when I first saw this material in somewhere on the street, in a market or something, I couldn't recognize what it was. And it's, again, these very ancient technologies that still exist, and that you couldn't find in the US, for example. And actually smells quite bad, especially when you heat it up. I remember that as a child, the smell of the cola being heated up by the carpenters to apply it. It's horrendous. And on the right is a piece made out of rose sugar. This is called panela, and this is our favorite drink. We make a tea out of it, and actually poor people, sometimes that's all they have the whole day is just this drink. And it's basically the most primitive stage of making sugar. And I made a piece that reminded me of some kind of constructivist modernist. And this is a piece called Bandera, flag, and it's made out of guava candy. And this is our favorite dessert. It's a candy made out of two kinds of guava, the red one and the yellow one. And we love this with a little bit of salty cheese. And all of these things, I realized, had smells and flavors that were not a common experience. For us, our identity was that common taste bud and scent experience. And it just brings you back home. And doing research on scent and our sense of smell, our smell area in the brain is in the oldest part, and it would trigger a lot of memories. So I was quite intrigued by all of these pieces that smelled and had a look that couldn't, it was kind of modernist and clean, minimalist, and only for the initiated we could know what it was. In the front I have these balls of soap we used to wash by hand to do the laundry. This is before powder detergents and washing machines. and it just looked like marbled, interesting blocks. And this blue soap is also for washing whites, and it makes them really white, and other soaps. And the brown one is called jabón de tierra, earth soap, and it's soap made out of fat and ashes. And it smells horrible, but you wash with it and it doesn't stick to you, the smell. And it actually, it's pretty good for your skin. And so I was kind of bringing out all of this technology in colonial houses. And my father's house, the entrance was paved with these tiles and incrustations of bones. So I made this piece with this type of bones that somehow resemble to me, look, Doric columns or the fist. It's actually the tibia, and it was quite hard to identify which bone it was. And I made a whole installation. And the patterns were inspired in the original tile floors. But when I did my research, these patterns actually are Moorish because the Spaniards came to the Americas, and this is all they could find to decorate the floors. And they titled this practice American marble. But because we were a poor colony, that's all they used. We didn't have stone like they had in Mexico or in Peru. So this was actually in the Simón Bolívar's villa. So this is fancy for a home to have. And but the patterns, I was quite intrigued by them and by the ordering of this surplus material, this waste material. And I realized they're Moorish. The Spanish, had the Arab influence. They brought it to the Americas, and then we made something different from it. Maybe with the influence of, the Indians burying bones underneath the houses. I also made a whole body work with gold, the idea of gold. And in the Gold Museum, they had recently discovered these beautiful helmets that just hammer gold and just look like those gold pieces. And these are gourds that I had gold leaf. And I found these frogs that they sell for a game, and it's actually a pre-Columbian game. You toss a ring onto the mouth of this frog. So I made this piece, which was a little bit of a reference to the Gold Museum and to my previous bodies of work with frogs. Another piece that had to do with the sense of home was inspired by a story told by my father. My father said that the conservatives were bad people. And I would ask him why. I said, well, they used to play soccer with the liberals' heads. And this is in the 50s. And it still happens today. So with this horror story, I made this piece. I actually bought 2 skeletons from the Central Cemetery, and I had them cleaned, and I had them cut so they won't have the eye sockets, and I glued them together, and I put this representation of a loop, like a graphic design of a rolling ball, so it makes reference to a part of our history. And this was meant to be shown with this body of work, but I never had the guts to do that. I made, these are vertical gardens or cemeteries. I was inspired by the flowers and how they are used to represent death. This is after working with the dead lizards and frogs. And I was a little bit tired of really looking at dead bodies all the time. So I thought, how else can I represent death? And I was walking on this cemetery, which was is very old and very close to my studio at that time. And the people put flowers on the walls, and it's just crypts on the walls. So I got the idea, and I developed it into this series of installations. This is at New York MoMA. And the skull was to be shown with this, but I had never really shown it. I made it, but never had. I made these funeral wreaths as well. So the sense of death, it's for me related to home. So how to represent death with beauty, for example, it's something. And I also traveled throughout Central America, Mexico, and Guatemala looking at flowers and at the Day of the Death kind of festivities. We have a Day of the Death every Monday in Colombia. So people go to the cemeteries and decorate and clean up their tombs. So I wanted to show you the only body of work that has nothing to do with home, the Cardoso Flea Circus. And it was actually a 6-year project. Here I am training fleas. And it was quite liberating. It was the first time that my work had nothing to do with context, with my cultural context. I was living in San Francisco at the time and evolved and even it carried with me when I moved to Australia. And it was completely independent of who I was, where I came from, or where I was living, and who my audience was. And that was extraordinary. It didn't even belong to the art world. It existed in the real world. And to me, that was exceptional. It didn't belong to galleries or museums. People just thought it was a flea circus. And also kids and old people came, all walks in life came. But when I moved to Australia, I thought, well, I knew I wanted to connect to Australia through its animals. And the first thing I did was trying to find the giant Australian flea. I think I show some slides here. This flea is 5 to 6 millimeters big. And I found in my research the human flea, which is the traditional flea circus flea, is 2 to 3 millimeters big, which I never was able to find. It might exist in some pigs or something, but it's not available to us. And I ended up working with the cat flea, which is similar in size to the human flea. So I went looking for the kangaroo flea, and I thought I will connect somehow that way. So I found a place where the kangaroos were tamed, and I tried to look for them, and I couldn't find anything but other than ticks. They are just full of ticks, but I enjoy being scratched, this thing. So this was a little kind of private performance. In Australia, I thought, well, working with kangaroos is too cliche for a newcomer. What can I do? So I started to work with sheepskins and making patterns with them. And I chose an animal that wasn't native to Australia, but it was very important in the Australian psyche. The image of the shearer, it's like the ultra macho ideal in Australia. And I worked and sheared all of these skins myself in a shearing shed in a farm in Australia, and tried to connect that way. And the analogy also with Colombia was that when I was growing up, my mother's family had a farm that had sheep, and they were the same breed of the sheep that I found I wanted to work with in Australia. They have the Merino, but no, this is Corriedale. So because my mother's farm had Corriedale, and they were imported from Australia. This is like maybe 100 years ago. And I remember sleeping in this. It was so cold, it was so high in the highlands. Instead of mattresses, they had beds that were just covered with sheepskins, and that's where we would sleep. And we also tie the ends and make little boxes and go down the hill like slippery slide on the skins. So it was a way to connect in both my my past, my old home, and my new home. And most recently, I finally attacked an Australian animal, the emu, and I started to make, this is an emu feather cape. I got hold of the feathers from an emu farmer. They are bred for, mostly the oil is quite valuable, it has a lot of healing qualities. And I started to make this cape that was not like any feather art I had seen before because it didn't have colors. Feather art, in maybe in Peruvian or Amazonian cultures, or even in the Aztec or Mayans, will be blues, yellows, reds, and these had really subdued colors. And I realized it was because these animals camouflage. And I had been doing research about mimicry and camouflage, and finally understood this bird, and I understood that if I was working with these colors of these feathers and these textures of these feathers, I was basically representing the landscape. So to me, these are landscapes, Australian landscapes. And because the perfection of the animal at copying its environment, I figured this is the best way of doing that. I also am a compulsive organizer, so I had cataloged different types of feathers from the different parts of the body and put them together. So you have very different results. These are, for example, the tail feathers, very different from these ones, which are more kind of in the neck. And the tail feathers in particular are very scratchy, and unlike any other feather you have ever touched. And they make a sound when you touch them, and they feel like dry grasses. So to me, the analogy between the feather and the grass and the landscape was quite obvious at working at them. And I encourage people to touch the pieces. I said, touch, it makes a sound. It feels like grass. So that has been my exploration. Another thing that fascinated me was the history and the behavior of this animal. It's an 80 million year old animal. It roamed the earth along with dinosaurs. And the male is the one that looks after the nest. The nest is basically a group of eggs that several females lay, and he sits in the nest for maybe 2 months without eating, drinking, or defecating. And he also looks after the chicks for the next year and a half. And the female goes and finds another mate. So I thought that was quite intriguing. I got the skin taxidermied. Instead of reconstructing feather by feather a surface, I thought I would try that. And I actually made a video of the skinning of the bird. And later I also got a veterinarian to give me an anatomy lesson, which we filmed. And we did a dissection, and he taught me everything about the emu inside. And it was part of the process of really getting to know this animal, because I felt really removed just purchasing feathers and them arriving in the post and me trying to make some sense of Australiana with it. So I felt that I really had to go all the way with this bird. It might shock some viewers. And speaking of mimicry and camouflage, parallel to all of this, I have been developing this concept for the last 10 years. I found this butterfly, it's called the Calima inachus, and this butterfly is called a dead leaf butterfly. And it really looks like a dead leaf, and when it stops in the branch, it positions itself like a dead leaf. And when it flies, it's colorful in the inside. And I thought, how brilliant. It uses both strategies. It's like, look at me, I'm pretty, come, mate with me. And then when a bird is going to try to eat it, it stops and disappears. So I was fascinated with this act of disappearance, but also by the kind of intelligence behind this animal. How does this animal know how a leaf looks like? And how can it copy it and replicate it perfectly? So I made a few pieces that use these butterflies. I made these branches. My idea was to make a whole tree full of these leaves, but this is more practical. So I made branches. And I had this idea to do a garden of insects that look like plants. And I had this idea 10 years ago, and finally last year I was able to execute it. And instead of making the branches myself, I used stick insects, and the dead-leaf butterfly. Stick insects really look like sticks, and the dead leaf looks like dead leaves. And I found this insect called katydids, and they actually look like fresh leaves. And to me, all of this had been a metaphor for my trying to blend in sometimes, or my trying to stand out sometimes. So in Australia, I'm trying to blend in and mimic their culture, which is actually working quite well. I got invited to collaborate with the Aboriginal women to do a project with emu feathers. And I am Colombian. So it's working. So I'm very excited about that. And stick insects, I have been breeding them for the last 3 years. So this is a live stick insect and a branch. And I made a video. And they put their hands up when they are still, and they really try to pretend to be a branch, branching out. It's quite interesting. In the right, it's an adult which had turned green. So these kind of stick insects, they when they are juveniles, they are brown. They look like sticks, and when they are adults, they look like leaves. So I'm just blown away by this animal. And the other thing that I found in my research was that mimicry is not just the looks, it's behavior. So, for example, they don't move when there is no wind, but if there's a little bit of a breeze, they move like a branch. They move, and that's why I made the video, because in a preserved case or in a photograph, this is still, but I couldn't capture the movement. And this whole thing of behavior, it's what it applies to us humans, trying to mimic and blend in our environment sometimes. I like the freedom that butterfly gave me of blending in sometimes and sometimes not. So it gave me a choice, which I found really liberating. And that's where I am. Oh, well, this is my next body of research, Australiana. So I want to keep developing Australiana, and I found that the marsupials have a very interesting penis, and I had been doing research for the last few years, and I want to get this project up and going, but I had not had luck funding it. But they have this bifork penis, and I also found echidna has kind of like a flower-like penis. And so I have been doing research on Australian penises, and my next project I hope to produce is, this is an insect, is the Australian Animal Penis Museum. Thank you very much.